So I'm going to talk for an hour or so. Well done for being here. It's 8 p.m. and it's gorgeous outside, so thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me. So I'm going to talk for an hour or so about 3D cinema and work towards thinking about the relationship between the spectator and the film when we watch 3D movies. If I don't speak clearly at any point, and if you'd like for me to repeat something, please ask. And if you want to ask a question whilst I'm talking, you don't need to kind of save everything for the end. You can do that if you want to, but just put your hand up and we can sort of discuss during the talk as well. Since this is about spectatorship, we probably actually ought to start with a bit of discussion, since maybe we've all seen 3D cinema and perhaps our personal experiences might be a good way for us to start thinking about a more sort of theoretical, perhaps slightly abstract definition of what 3D spectatorship is. So I have some questions here. Has anyone here seen any films in 3D? Yeah? Show of hands? How many people? Most people? Okay, good. Do you like those films that you've seen in 3D? Yeah. Some? Okay. Some shaking of heads, nodding of heads. If so, why? Which ones have you liked, and if you have any thoughts as to why, would you share them with us? We have it definitely, yes.
Because of the impression that we get, how strong it is, and this space effect, that how you feel while you're watching.
Okay, for sure. Like today's film that you showed for us.
That example.
No, I think it was a great example. I'm going to talk about it.
I'm talking about more enhanced 3D effect that we get in mainstream films.
For sure. Okay, so this enhanced effect. There was a shaking of the head here. You said you didn't particularly enjoy 3D movies. Any?
I started for my eyes.
Tiring for my eyes. This is common, and we're going to start to talk about that because, broadly speaking, to give a kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Broadly speaking, I'm going to argue today that 3D cinema is in effect a tool that is best used in the services of what I'll call art house filmmaking as opposed to mainstream filmmaking. Doesn't mean that mainstream films are all bad, and in fact there are some good ones. Avatar is still, the highest grossing film of all time, and a lot of that money was made with that film showing in 3D, so clearly spectators did enjoy that and can enjoy it in 3D cinema. But I'm going to argue that nonetheless it's perhaps best served for art house purposes. So we're going to talk about depth. We're going to talk about this idea of negative versus positive parallax. And maybe everyone knows a lot of what I'm going to talk about already. So I apologise if this is kind of teaching, what in English we would say, teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. It's a strange phrase. But anyway, if I'm doing that, I apologise. We'll talk about negative versus positive parallax. I'm going to argue that cinema has in fact always been 3D. All 2D cinema is in fact 3D. So to do that, we're going to talk about time. This is perhaps a fourth dimension that actually is the crucial point around which we can begin to understand what 3D cinema is. We're going to talk about cutting rates and why fast cutting rates is precisely what makes 3D cinema, when it's sort of in its mainstream iteration, is quite annoying or uncomfortable or headache making. And ask for slower cinemas. I'm going to argue that 3D cinema is actually really a 4D cinema, in the same way that 2D cinema is really a 3D cinema. We'll talk about post-human elements of that cinema. We're going to use Hugo as an example. Then we're going to talk about embodiment. Go for the basis that film viewing is always embodied, but perhaps that 3D cinema brings out a slightly different type of embodied spectatorship or response to film. And that's going to sound at loggerheads initially to the post-human, because if there's this sort of thing that's not human and then there's embodiment which is very human, then we've got to work out how those two sit together. And then I'm going to kind of go a bit crazy and talk about difference and connection, learning and language, and I'll leave those sort of mini subject matters a little bit opaque because it will be hard for me to describe until we get there. It's like I say, hopefully about an hour. Lucas, you can correct me when I'm sort of going on for too long. So, grandmother's sucking eggs, perhaps you know this. Depth. 3D cinema is about spatial planes. So what happens is you've got two eyes, that are looking at a screen, and you've got two images that are projected simultaneously onto that screen. And what we can do is, by bringing closer to the audience, where it is that those two images converge, where the kind of focal depth is, we get negative parallax. So that's when an object comes out of the screen towards you. Buona Devil, the first 3D movie from 1952 by Archer Bola, is sold upon precisely this. You'll have a lion in your lap. You'll have a lover in your arms. So it's about things coming out of the screen towards you. Definite exploitation of negative parallaxing. And this comes through to sort of more contemporary exploitation films like Big Tits, Zombie 3D, which is all about pushing towards the viewer certain things which are in the film to make that sort of experience more enjoyable. But an important thing to remember about 3D cinema is that there is also positive parallax. Actually, that we can go very far back in depth into the image. And that actually is often considered to be the far more sort of artistic way of using 3D. Movies that chuck stuff at the audience are often critiqued for being exploitative, as Big Tits Zombie 3D makes clear. It's clearly an exploitation film. Whereas when you use positive parallax, this is often considered to be a lot more kind of measured, thought through, considered 3D filming. So we've got this idea. This is sort of how 3D works, basically. And we have this sort of dichotomy that seems to emerge straight away between things coming towards the spectator and things progressing away from the spectator. So, cinema has always been 3D, however. And how am I going to argue this? I'm going to argue this by showing you some of anemic cinema by the French artist Marcel Duchamp. Have you heard of Marcel Duchamp? Famous for his laboratory against the wall. Perhaps you've seen this film, but it's always nice to watch it with. So I'm going to talk over the rest of the film, but you've seen two examples already of the spinning cylinders. My argument would be is it's quite difficult not to see depth in those images, even though this is only a 2D image. Now, Duchamp has brought to our attention something quite specific using a trick, but I'm going to extrapolate from that and say that actually this is kind of how we view 2D cinema anyways, is that we're always kind of seeing depth in those images, and there's a whole history of deep focus as a technique which has been sort of lauded as an artistic technique from Wells and Renoir as the kind of the more well-known proponents of it, William Wyler, other people onwards. And so, actually, if we go from the starting point that 2D cinema has always been 3D, we can now then sort of build towards this idea that 3D cinema might in fact be a 4D cinema. So I'm going to come out of Duchamp, because I just want to kind of make a little point about puns. The slides, slideshow, the images that we have in between rotating circles in the film are kind of full of French words, which is sort of nonsense in a lot of ways. They're kind of tongue twisters. It's like, oh, there's a T in the eighth T, and it sort of doesn't make any sense if you're a French speaker, but he's just sort of playing around with words. And for me, that actually is a very intelligent thing that Duchamp's doing in conjunction with these images. Because a pun, a play on words, is a technique that brings out a kind of hidden dimension of that word, a hidden meaning, by putting it into a new context. So a new depth, in fact, to that word is brought to our attention, and we understand it in a new and different way. And actually this is a kind of visual pun, because what we have in front of us is, of course, only a two-dimensional flat image, but we're seeing into it this third hidden dimension. And so actually this is maybe the sort of modus operandi of cinema normally, 2D cinema, and its normal kind of iteration, this sort of sense of punning visually, if that makes sense. People go along with this so far. Is that sort of making some sense? Yeah? Okay. Oops, no, didn't want to do that. Maybe. Okay. So we've got this notion of time. And time is obviously sort of a key component of cinema. If we looked at the history of mainstream filmmaking, and this is taken from Cinemetrics website, which is Cinemetrics is a sort of large-scale study that's been conducted by a large number of scholars from all over the world, but it in principle comes out of research that I've done here in Sydney, who's based in Chicago. And he's sort of charted how cutting rates have got faster and faster as the history of cinema has gone on. So in the kind of, and this is from the 30s alone. So in the kind of classical period, it's often thought that your average shot length, I mean here it seems to get up to 10, but the average shot maybe cuts across here about sort of 8-9 seconds per shot. So you have quite a lot of time to search the image whilst you're watching these sort of classical Hollywood films. And when I show classical Hollywood films to my students, including Citizen Kane, for example, they're kind of within about 2 minutes. They've got films on. And it's slow, right? And because movies have got faster and faster. And we get to the contemporary age where we have Michael Bay films, Transformers, Pain and Gain. I don't know if anyone's seen either of these particular films. In fact, this is supposed to be Transformers 2, the best of the four so far. But that's a joke. But the cutting rate in those films is about 2 seconds. So it's really fast. It's going very fast. Now there's a whole discourse to be had about what is the effect of these cutting rates on attention and the attention economy that we live in, which is all about presenting to us refreshed visual display that attracts our attention for very kind of natural reasons. Oh, something fast moving in my field of vision. Is this a predator? Is this a prey? Is this a mate? I'm going to look at it. I don't know if you're ever in a pub. When I'm in the pub in London, I hate it when football's on and I don't want to watch the game because I'm talking to my friend and I'm just going like this the whole time, up to the TV screen. Because of the fast visual sort of repetition. So it's understandable why this technique is developed, because it's about keeping your eyeballs on the screen so that whoever's trying to sell you whatever it is that's on the screen in terms of lifestyle, in terms of products, in terms of just simply being part of the cinematic experience, it's understandable why this technique has developed this sort of fast cutting rate. But when it comes to 3D, actually this makes for quite a disappointing experience. Because when you have a fast cutting rate when you're watching a 3D movie, you need longer for your eyes to adjust to what it is that you're seeing, to the visual display, because of the depth. Because you're not quite sure where to focus initially. It's very easy to focus, even on a kind of depth of field image, because it's kind of a flat 2D image. And I'd argue about the depth, we project that depth into it. But when it's actually a 3D image, where there is sort of a much more sort of real depth, what is required, therefore, is more time. So the average disappointment that you get from going to watch, and I went to see Maleficent was okay, Planet of the Apes, the new one I went to see in 3D both this sort of past week. It was quite sort of uncomfortable at times because they're shot often as 2D films and then they're converted to 3D films. The reason why they're converted to 3D films is simply economics. It took years to persuade mainstream cinemas to install 3D projectors. They cost a lot of money. There was a huge argument as to who was going to pay this money to install $150,000 projector. So the studios kind of had to promise that they would be providing content. but they have to train filmmakers to be making 3D movies more generally. Well, that hasn't, that takes a lot of time. So, but what we can do is convert 2D movies to 3D movies, and which is what regularly happens. And we can put these 3D movies, 2D, 3D conversion movies into the cinemas, so that the cinema owners are happy that they're still getting content and they're showing these films. And actually, the audience members aren't particularly happy. We can still go, at least I still go, in the hope that it's going to be a good one. And generally it's not, because it's just a conversion film. And it's made with this fast cutting rate that isn't really appropriate for 3D cinema. And I think this for me is kind of what explains this sense of disappointment, the headache that you might get, but also why it kind of persists, and why this time, because we've had a 50s 3D explosion, we've had an 80s revival, and the 2000s now it's happening, why people think it's kind of here to stay. I should point out, though, that actually 3D is older than cinema. 1838 was when Charles Winston invented three-dimensional imaging. The Lumiere brothers, in fact, were experimenting with it towards the end of their career as well. So it has actually a very long history that is worth going and checking out. But as things stand, basically, what David Bordwell, because people know of David Bordwell here, he's a sort of well-known American film scholar. He calls the sort of contemporary style intensified continuity. So it's about fast cutting rates. The camera is always moving. There's lots of motion on screen. People are moving about. It's kind of action cinema, basically. This is the sort of dominant trend in mainstream filmmaking today. So the 2D intensified continuity style is not suited to three-dimensional cinema. So what 3D demands then perhaps is a kind of a slower aesthetic. Longer takes, longer shots, so that we get both depth of space, but actually we get a depth of a different dimension, depth of time. You get a sense of duration, of things changing at their own pace, rather than having, through editing, imposed upon the action that we see a different rhythm that is that of the filmmaker. Does that make sense? So we've got this sense of, and here I'm going to digress, this sort of sense of seeing far, seeing back, and perhaps seeing bodies and rhythms. So what I mean by seeing far, I'm going to sort of come back to this a bit. So this is a sort of theme, sort of wheel its way back and talk of seeing far. I had this realization when I was in London. London is a city that is full of kind of very high buildings, and it's actually quite difficult to see very far in a visual field, because it will often end up being quickly obstructed by a tall building. And my favourite space in London is walking across a bridge on the River Thames. And I was trying to think about why this is, and I think it's because I get to see some depth, because there's no buildings on the river, so I can see all the way along the river. And actually, this sort of moment of seeing depth, I enjoy it because I'm presented with a far richer visual field. When everything is only a wall that far away from me, and I can't see beyond it, and I don't really, and it's a blank wall, then I'm not really sort of occupied particularly. I can't invest too much into my visual field. So seeing depth, I think, is a very important, pleasurable experience. I don't know what you guys feel about, say, being here. And when I look outside, I'm just happy. I can climb up on the roof, and I'm happy because I can see far, right? This is why we like climbing up on tall buildings, in order to get a good view. Because depth of visual field is very pleasing to us. And when you don't have that, it's a fast visual turnover in the image, it doesn't sort of feel so good. But also there's a sense of seeing back, I think. And this film here on the left, Werner Herzog's Age of Forgotten Dreams. I don't know if anyone had the chance to see this movie when it came out. Considered sort of quite a good example of artistic and perhaps importantly documentary 3D cinema. This is about early cave paintings. It's not Lascaux. I can't remember the name of the cave, but let's call it Lascaux Cave in France. So there's a sense here of also the pleasure of seeing back in time. And actually, when we're surrounded by only the modern, and we're surrounded not by what is older, we don't really get a sense of the depth of time itself, the age of the universe, the age of the world that surrounds us, how old a tree might be. This is a shot in vertigo of the rings of the tree, this sort of sense of getting a sense of the depth of time. And so duration, the long take, is also sort of quite pleasurable because we get a sense of perhaps of history to a certain extent. We get a sense of maybe our smallness within the world, but that in and of itself is an enlightening experience because our minds are now expanded beyond me and my phone screen, looking at this in my little room, in my little building, in my built-up environment, and instead I'm kind of actually feeling much more what I'll call end-worldly. Does that make sense? And I think actually seeing bodies and rhythms is very important, and my favourite 3D film so far that I've seen, and if you ever get a chance to see it in 3D, I highly recommend it, is this film here, Kino, by Wim Wenders. And Kino was mentioned earlier on today during the talk on performance art. And this is a wonderful film because it's a dance movie. And what is great about dance is that it's about rhythm, and we see different people moving at different paces, different rhythms. And we see bodies doing things that are very unusual to us. And I think that that seeing of difference, that seeing of a different rhythm, that sense that someone else leads their life at a different pace to us, the sense of the variation of rhythms, of the difference of time, is also quite a pleasurable one. And I think that 3D, when used by Wenders in this film, appeals to that particular process. It's like when you, and you know, I live my life, I'm in a rush all the time. I need to get everywhere, and then I see a colleague of mine, he's this guy called Michael Witt, and he's kind of very much that sort of a bit more senior academic, and he's really relaxed about everything. He's sort of, yeah, you know, I should do it in my own time, sort of wander slowly, and kind of, oh, it's a different rhythm. And I love this slower rhythm, and I wish I could leave this slower rhythm, but instead I'm sort of too caught up in this capitalistic rush everywhere, and I'm blind and solipsistic and narcissistic and stupid. But, you know, this is what I mean by kind of different rhythms and bodies, and I think 3D kind of appeals to this. So really that's 3D cinema is a 4D cinema. It's actually about, and this is something that's hinted at by Thomas Elsässer in an essay that he's written about 3D cinema, but he doesn't sort of quite draw it out in the way that I think that he should do. Thomas Elsässer is also sort of quite a senior film studies scholar. I think I'm racing through it. It may not even be an hour, you'll be pleased to know. But we're going to watch it quickly in a second. So I want to talk about this sort of sense of the post-human. And what do I mean by this? Well, this is kind of cinema offering us impossible perspectives about seeing something that we could not see from the human eye. And I have an example of this from Hugo. Has anyone seen Hugo here? As, I think, one of the best 3D films as well. Martin Scorsese. Should I ask someone? Seen Hugo? A couple of people? Okay. So this is a shot from very early on. And I'm going to let this play and then talk about it afterwards. So this is going to be loud. This is the sort of opening shot of everyone. So we have this kind of, I call it the fantasy of free movement. This kind of incredible opening shot from high up outside the Montparnasse station. The camera comes out in 3D terms, if we could watch it in 3D. Lots of positive parallax here, lots of depth, and then moving into that depth. So, and then we have this impossible journey. No human could get across a train platform in the way that the camera seems to during this moment. There is a hidden cut when the steam comes up, and obviously there's a large amount of digital imagery involved in this, in terms of the people that we see and the mise en scène more generally. But nonetheless, we have in this moment a kind of an effective use of a sort of post-human perspective that is combined with this sense of positive parallax. so depth in effect, and moving into that depth quite importantly. So the sense here of when we have 3D used very effectively, it does not cut, which I think is very important. It's about continuity of space, moving through space as if it were a single field, and continuity of time, allowing to move through that without cutting, even though there is a big cut. So there's a slight sheet through the film, but he gives us the impression that there isn't a cut. And then we come up to Hugo, who is behind this clock, of course, so the film is also about time, and Hugo's relationship to time, told us opening moments of the movie. Later on in the film, we have moments where human characters, and not the 3D digital camera, try to get across the station. It's still shot in 3D, but suddenly now we're engaging with the human characters trying to get across the station. And we'll have a look at how this goes in terms of how the movement is made. Now, we'll look at one example and then I'll perhaps... Get out of here! I'll let a couple of these clips sort of play out because it happens several times in the film, but it's clear from the cutting regime where we have initially this sort of post-human 3D perspective with lots of negative parallax. When humans try to replicate a sort of free flow across space, it's impossible. There's all of these obstacles, you can't sort of quite get through, and this is also reflected now in the fact that the movie is cutting. So perhaps it becomes a slightly more unpleasant viewing experience from the perspective of 3D spectatorship. But nonetheless, this is also telling us something about the way in which the human is limited, perhaps, in their perspective on space, and yet cinema seems to sort of open us up to these plumbed, hidden, impossible dimensions that take us beyond what we kind of normally are, and into this realm of seeing further into space, further into time, different rhythms and different paces. There's a nice Jean Renoir reference here to La Bête Humaine coming up. If you've seen that film, which is well worth seeing if you haven't. Which itself is about kind of the structuring of space according to kind of time periods. The train is a sort of key example of the way in which both sort of the nation is constructed, because it's about creating a homogeneous space in which everyone is running according to the same rhythm, train timetables, and it's about kind of the regulation of time within the kind of the contemporary modern industrial world, as opposed to the sort of the free personal time that is me going about things at my own rhythm. I'm now rushing for the train. That is kind of the archetypal experience of a temporal rhythm imposed upon us, a cinematic rhythm perhaps even imposed upon us, as opposed to us being allowed to move at our own pace. So, someone have any questions at all? So we've got this sense here of post-human. 3D cinema offers us impossible perspective. We have this articulated clearly in Hugo, where we have the opening moments, which then can be juxtaposed with the chases across the Gare Montparnasse in Paris. I was going to link this to sort of this as an installation, because I think there was sort of something interesting going on there that really kind of was brought to mind for me, talking about the sound involved and this sort of the hum that might be the hum of the projector when we're down in that room looking at it. So there's a sequence in Hugo, which I have on a DVD, so perhaps to show you later, where the young Hugo goes with the film scholar to the house of Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès is a great early filmmaker, silent filmmaker, made all of these sort of trick movies and Voyage to the Moon and so on and so forth. And he goes with a film that Méliès made, in which he is found and kind of restored. And they set up a home projection in the house of Méliès. And Méliès' wife is kind of, don't show this film. He's rejected. It's been forgotten by the filmmaking community. His cinema is dead. It's been replaced by narrative cinema. It's been replaced by sort of a type of filmmaking that means that his is now defunct. And the scholars kind of know that these films are so brilliant, we need to show them. So they have this kind of fantasy moment where they project the movie in their home. And Méliès comes out and he says, the first line that he says off screen, I think, is, I would recognise the sound of the film projector anyway. And this is linked, again, with sort of Tom Gurring, who's film scholars, sort of analysis of early cinema, as this being a cinema of attractions. What he means by this is that we don't really watch kind of early cinema for its story. We kind of watch it as a sort of technological marvel. And part of that technological marvel is this quite embodied experience of being able to hear the projector. And so when we get to 3D cinema, sort of paradoxically enough, I think Sawyer's sort of work is bringing back to mind, even through simulation rather than necessarily because we're actually hearing the real projector, we're hearing the kind of fake projector, bringing back to mind this sort of very embodied experience of watching a movie. And in fact, the kind of the spatial display that we have, even though he disavows and says that he doesn't like it anymore, but the visual display that we have is very simple, just an early attraction. It's a space. Nothing more. We don't need narrative. We don't need anything else linked to memory in his particular case. But nonetheless, it's there. This is about watching the image for the image's sake. There's this kind of pureness, purity to this sort of moment of engagement, and it is a very embodied one. So this kind of early cinema and then 3D cinema now seems to be sort of linked through this kind of self-consciousness to a certain extent. So I've just been talking about embodiment, and I've been talking about this sort of post-human. I'm going to digress onto a film that wasn't released in 3D, nor made in 3D, but it has a key moment in which one of the characters is looking at a stereoscope in it, and this is a film called Django Unchained. I don't know if anyone saw Django Unchained. A few people. So it's a Quentin Tarantino film. This is about a slave, a former slave who's kind of liberated, and then he goes and kills basically everyone who's ever had anything to do with his life from Hilda being taken captive. Cinema has been sort of built up on, or at least film theory has built up, had built up for a long time this notion that film viewing is disembodied. We know that this isn't true because when we go to the movies, we hear sound. Particularly if we're in a surround sound cinema screen, we're kind of vibrating with the film. We can often sort of get a sense of touch and flinch, and if we're watching the right kind of film, we might get sexually aroused. These kinds of things. There's very much our bodies are very present with us. Nonetheless, there's this sort of idea that grew up in the 70s really in film theory that somehow we would watch a film in quite a disembodied fashion. It was pure scopophilia. This was just us looking and not really being involved in it. It was a distance. It was a kind of peeping Tom moment. It was me seeing and not being seen. I wasn't implicated in my act of viewing. Now, I think this is kind of, to a certain extent, old hat, but nonetheless it's worth putting that idea of disembodied viewing into some kind of historical context. And this is where Django comes in useful. Because Django has a couple of sequences which tell us about what the meaning is of trying to create a world in which there is such a thing as a disembodied, abstracted viewer. And it's made most clearly in the sequence here where we have these guys, sort of proto-Ku Klux Klan members in, what's the word I'm after? Pillowcases that have holes in them. And what is the point of making the pillowcases? What is the point of the Ku Klux Klan having these hoods with just eye holes in them? It's so that you're deprived of the face. You become simply someone who looks, but who isn't seen. You're not implicated in what you do. And what this does is if you look and you are not implicated, if you have no eye contact necessarily, if you have no sort of facial recognition, from mirroring your own research, we would say this is the sort of condition of empathy. I'll talk about that a bit more if you like. But we have no connection. So now that we have no connection, I don't have to care about you, because I'm never going to be shamed. You're never going to find out about who I am. I just look at you, so I can actually now treat you, a human being, as a commodity. I can treat you as a slave. So the history, in effect, of capitalist exploitation, to a certain extent, is linked with this idea of not being an embodied member of the world, but in fact sort of somehow disembodied, and in fact being able to treat other human beings in an exploitative fashion. This is what Django's bringing out. And it's very funny in this film, because their masks don't work and they can't see, and so Tarantino seems to sort of build up this argument that you always are embodied, you can try not to be, and this is why he sort of subverts this sort of Ku Klux Klan moment. And there is a moment where one of the characters in the film is also looking at a stereoscope, and this is the image that they see, which is, I think this is supposed to be a Greek piece of architecture. One person I've read thinks that they know which stereogram that is, but it's never been confirmed. But anyway, this is sort of the moment in the film. So there's a sense here in which this character is looking at the stereoscope, who's one of the kind of the racists, as it were. Sort of has a sense in which maybe there's a history of 3D viewing being associated with this idea of disembodied viewing, of the myth of objectivity somehow. That if we can detach ourselves from the world and look at it in an objective fashion, I am not really part of the world, I'm just able to look at it. Now I can manipulate that world as much as possible. Where if I'm in the world, it's suddenly much more complex. So it's about 3D power and imperialism. And there's a scholar called Leon Gurevich who does this fantastic analysis of Avatar, which I highly recommend that people go. And he basically finds shot after shot from Avatar that is kind of almost the precise replica of early 3D images, and the way in which those sort of circulating 3D images were part of this idea of treating the other, the savage in South America, or the savage in Southeast Asia, as this kind of spectacle. We don't look at them as human and detached and a disembodied observer of them. But here we have this kind of undermined, I think. So actually, and I think that 3D can't sustain this myth of disembodiment. In fact, 3D precisely calls for this embodied viewing. But film viewing has always been embodied. This is us shaking, this is us laughing, this is us crying. We know that we're watching films with our bodies. So there's a bit of a digression about this myth of disembodiment. But it's important because actually we might get a sense here of how 3D filmmaking gives us a sense of being in the world and with each other, and how 3D therefore might be a tool, bizarrely enough, for subverting this process of disembodiment which is linked to exploitation. So we're always enworlded, or in terms of physicists called Karen Barrett, we're entangled. And this is a term that she takes from Niels Bohr. I believe there was a talk yesterday that was kind of on quantum physics and cinema. Am I right? So, part of my research kind of looks into this as well. It's this idea of, I think you were sort of told about kind of the split screen experiment and the idea of the observer affecting which direction the electron or whichever kind of minute particle it is, and the experiment's been replicated with different types of particle, affects the path that it takes. So in effect, we cannot help but realise that we are in the world. We are actually always changing the world. We're enworlded, or we're entangled in the universe. And perhaps this is sort of what 3D cinema is trying to say to us. Now, Francisco in his talk earlier also kind of brought up this distinction between cognition and perception, and I think that that's worth working through a little bit as well, if that's okay. So we have perception. Perception is that immediate moment I see something. Cognition is that moment where I'm able to recognise what it is that is, what that thing is. So rather than going from a visual display that I sort of can't quite work out what it is yet, now I'm like, oh, I know that I'm looking at a person sat on a chair. So that's the sort of slight distinction between cognition and perception. And I think that films are always kind of balancing those two different things. And this is from French philosopher Jean Nancy. He uses this term, he uses a couple of terms, monstrosity and presence. And for him, presence, that moment where the image is before us, unmediated, even though the image is a mediation, but we are presented with it for the first time. It is pre-sense. This is kind of perception as opposed to cognition. This is before we can make sense of that image. And that is a moment where I'm now not using my brain to understand what this image is, but in fact I'm having to use kind of something else. Or certainly if I am using my brain, the part of my brain that I'm using is not necessarily the one that is concerned with language and with interpretation of the world. It's something a little bit different. So there's a sense in which cinema is always presenting a pre-sense to us, where we now are forced to work, to do cognition in order to recognise what it is. But if we isolate that moment of perception and pre-sense, we get a very clear demonstration of how cinema is always an embodied viewing experience. And this is perhaps emphasised a little bit more in three-dimensional cinema. So we're going to get on to the kind of slightly more opaque section. I might come in under time. I apologise. Maybe I don't get my theory.
Plenty of time, actually.
Yeah. So I want to sort of try to bring together a bunch of things that we've been talking about in sort of fairly suggestive ways, let's say. So enworldment, this idea of being entangled, and part of the world suggests connection. I am with all of you people in this room, and we're all with each other, and we're with the material support that we have that is keeping us here, and we're breathing oxygen that is contained as a result of the gravity of our planet, which means that we're kind of totally kind of end-worlded. Nothing that we do here can happen without all of these material conditions, which then require a universe in and of itself, and we can go all back to the Big Bang. So there's a sense of being connected. Everything is kind of connected in this way. And it suggests otherness in space. What do I mean by this? This is about colour. When I say think about the Ganzfeld, this blue quadrangle that we see here, rectangle, is from a film by Derek Jarman called Blue. And the film is a blue screen that lasts for about 75 minutes with talking over it by Jarman and various other people reflecting upon his life. This is when he was dying of AIDS in the mid-90s. Now, I'm bringing blue up because blue is a Ganzfeld. This is a German term in sort of blind field. You can't sort of see anything. Drivers have this experience sometimes when they're driving in the snow, blindness. Suddenly you can't tell depth because everything is white and there are car crashes as a result of this. So this is because your visual field is entirely homogeneous. And when your visual field is entirely homogeneous, you can't see space. So actually our perception of space is very much linked to our sense of colour. I was thinking about this, sat there earlier today trying to look through these windows and these sort of ever so tiny different shades of brown and green that were sort of coming through, and how I was able to kind of perceive depth as a result of ever so minute differences that many cameras can't pick up, but the human eye can in our visual field. And so depth is dependent upon variation in colour, which is dependent upon therefore sensitivity to the human eye. So we have the sense of connection, but then this connection is also about otherness and difference, because you can only know that to which we are connected as a result of recognising that it is also different from us. Because if we didn't see any difference whatsoever, we would be in the Ganzfeld, we would be blind, everything would be flat, we wouldn't be able to move, we would crash our cars, we would be snowblind to a certain extent. So you have this idea of connection, which suggests on a certain level everything's the same. That's not the case. Connection actually seems to imply much more that everything is infinitely different, and that we're sort of connected to it. And what applies to space here also seems to apply to time. And this is the kind of the ongoing sense of change that we have, duration. There is no homogeneity of time. We never, outside of science fiction films, get to go back and repeat the same moment Groundhog Day. And even when we do it differently every time. And if you watch these kind of more sort of complex sci-fi space time travel movies, you get multiple parallel universes emerging all over the show. So what's true of space, the sort of gradation of colour giving us depth, is perhaps also true of time. And so we've got this sense of connection. I am connected to every single moment in time, right back to the Big Bang. If that hadn't happened, I would not be here. It is a condition, a precondition of my existence, and therefore I must recognise how I'm connected to that event. Maybe here we have a Badiouian event, the only one, I would contend, and even using Roger Penrose and Sean Carroll, I don't think that that's true of Badiou as well. That's an aside. We have this sort of sense in which otherness in time, this sort of sense of difference is linked to our connection, is also about connection. So we've got the post-human, we've got this idea of otherness, and we've got embodiment, we've got the fact that I'm always only ever in this thing. So can there be a post-human embodiment? And I would say yes, quite simply. That's the actual, sort of the ontology, this is our baseline existence. And what do I mean by this? This is about learning. So I'm going to appeal to neuroscience and students. New neuronal pathways, going beyond ourselves. New neuronal pathways. So when we come out into the world, the way in which our brain functions hasn't necessarily been set. And over the first few months of our lives, as a result of very repetitive behaviour on the part of our parents, we begin to make sort of clear neuronal pathways, we begin to learn stuff. And once those become sort of quite set, we begin to see things in quite a systematic fashion. I now see the chair, I see the chair. I don't need to worry about seeing the chair. I'm not going to marvel at it, it's just a chair. My brain, straight down, that kind of neuronal pathway is set. But then what can happen every once in a while in our life is that we suddenly see that chair completely differently, and a new neuronal pathway is perhaps constructed. And this is a moment of learning, this sort of moment of novelty, it's a moment of newness. This is about precisely coming into contact with something that we have not yet been, the potential for which is there because we have all of these trillions of connections within our brain, which haven't necessarily happened yet, and when they do happen, we're seeing things as if for the first time, we're seeing something new for the first time. So this is what learning is. And this is about the progression of the human, what we are, into what we have not yet become, into the post-human. And so embodiment and post-humanity for me are entirely synonymous the one with the other. And so this is about learning, and it's about going beyond ourselves. It's about looking into that space and going beyond me and my iPod screen and into sort of something different, and about going backwards in time as well. So we're going beyond ourselves. I sometimes argue that it's about sort of being beside oneself. In English we have this phrase of being beside oneself with laughter. And I think that there's something in here comic about this. Is anyone here ticklish at all? Do you laugh when you tickle? I sort of sometimes wonder when you're ticklish, this is basically a very sensitive part of your body being touched. But it hasn't been touched very much before. What does this do? It makes us laugh. And I find when I'm kind of in a space where I haven't really seen the things that I've seen before, I also tend to laugh personally as well. So I think there's something here to comment about, this sort of sense of going beyond ourselves and learning. But then this is always going to be about language. We're going to get to who else but Ronnie Woodall and his new film Farewell to Language, which I've not seen. I'm going to speculate a little bit about what he might be getting at in making a 3D film called Farewell to Language. So language, this is that moment of cognition. This is about turning that perception into something that I can understand. Now if I'm seeing something that I've never seen for the first time, however, I have to suddenly invent a language or find a new way of expressing what it is that I'm seeing. Now, I want to sort of talk about that properly. So, we can watch stuff and we can experience new things the whole time. I suspect actually we are doing this regularly, but we don't often feel compelled to turn that into language. Maybe what we do when we study film, however, is we endeavour to turn that into language in order to share our experiences. And so we're perhaps always at the limit of language. Now we can use preset language in whatever way we want, and we can just talk, be cliches in effect, and say, yeah, I'm sick as a parrot, yeah, I'm gutted, whatever. that doesn't really matter to me, and so on. And you kind of know what I'm talking about, but the language is being used very loosely there. This is a cliche. I'm not really explaining what I'm talking about. I'm using the language to actually hide what I'm talking about. So this is a moment of actually forcing ourselves to think about how we're going to communicate what it is that we want to communicate, what it is that we're actually feeling. My body suddenly is now up against cognition and language, and I need to force my brain to develop a language in order to explain what it is that my body is doing. Now maybe it's even being spoken, verbal language, perhaps as Kino makes clear to us, this can be in dance. Perhaps as a filmmaker, this can be in the way in which we make movies and the kinds of camera movements and the kinds of images that we portray. So Wittgenstein, at the end of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, has this famous phrase, whereof we cannot speak, we must be silent. Maybe, would be, but I would say that whereof we cannot speak, we must do our best to develop a language so that we can speak about it, in order that we might mutually benefit from that and learn and become new and more improved and more progressive, changing people. So to a certain extent, when we watch 3D cinema, we don't know that we necessarily have the language for it at the moment. And this is made clear, this is something I was talking to Lucas about, made clear by the way in which 3D cinema engenders a form of criticism that goes all the way back to the 70s, prior to the days of VHS and DVD. You used to read these, or nowadays you read these essays by the names that I gave earlier, Andrew Saris, Robin Wood, but all sorts of figures from this sort of period in time. And they were writing their film criticism based on having watched the movie in a cinema, gone away for a while, and they couldn't readily go back and just watch the film, so they had to try and write about it through recall. And you find gross inaccuracies often in a lot of film criticism from this early periods. People misremember movies. 3D is also an experience that's very difficult to replicate outside of the cinema. There are 3D televisions, you can get those, but they're expensive, not many people do have them. And so often when you watch a 3D film, unless you absolutely love Gravity and you go to watch it 8 times at the cinema, which maybe you do, and I'm sure some people have, you maybe only have sort of one viewing of it, and you can't just sort of go back and watch the 2D DVD of that and really get a sense of what it was like. So it's a kind of return of impressionistic criticism to a certain extent, is involved in how we can try to think about 3D, or at least up until now this seems to be the case. And it's also challenges our powers of description again. So actually it calls for a new language. What is 3D cinema? What is our experience of it? And I'm not necessarily saying that I'm giving you an accurate description right now of what 3D cinema is, but what I'm trying to draw out is the process that is sort of engendered as a result of the 3D cinema experience as it stands so far. So we have this sense of impressionistic criticism and description. I'm going to try and sort of relate this back to both this idea of learning. So this is about the post-human, this is about coming across things that we haven't necessarily seen for the first time. This is about these impossible camera movements. It's about different rhythms in terms of Kino, and these kind of slower rhythms in particular that are demanded as a result of the long take and the long shot, perhaps, the depth and the duration that seems to be what 3D cinema demands as an aesthetic, as opposed to this imposition of that fast rhythm upon us and our kind of everyday habit of, oh, I must watch the football on the TV rather than engage with what's around me. So we have this sort of sense of impressionist criticism and description sort of linked to this idea of 3D. So maybe when Godard says, well, farewell to language, adieu langage, he's sort of trying to draw out the way in which 3D maybe could be a new paradigm that actually draws humans into kind of a greater level of consciousness to a certain extent, because it demands from us a rethinking of our relationship with film, perhaps, but then maybe by extension also with the space of time itself. So this isn't necessarily about, and here's where kind of why I brought up kind of cognition perception thing. It's not necessarily about body perception and cognition mind as being sort of separate. Actually, it's the conjunction of the two, sort of body and mind, which is an argument that's put forward by sort of a key neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio in terms of sort of his understanding of how the brain and the body work, and they're always working in conjunction. our emotions are not separate from our intellect. In fact, the one and the other mutually feed into each other, and we don't. There is no such thing as a kind of crazy, emotional person who doesn't have reason guiding the way in which they really work, the way in which they conduct themselves in the world. And if they did, then they would be better people. This isn't the case at all. Emotion and reason, body and mind are always working in conjunction. And I think that this is sort of something again that 3D cinema seems to draw, to make sort of clear to us. So I think I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you. I hope that's made some sense. But if you have any questions, please ask. But anyway, cheers.